I'm looking at that like, oh, you win some, you lose some, you know. That was 15 years ago. And I wrote that, I guess, about 17 years ago. And overall, to me, it's a shame that there's some relevance to part of this thing. But on the other hand, it's exciting to me. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that so much of what is happening now in the States and globally, but I'll focus on here with organizations like Black Lives Matter and looking at the women and queer and trans communities behind and in front of these movements, and I'm thinking of how seeds have been planted by the people that planted seeds in me, and then us trying to pay it forward through our work. And so it's wonderful actually to be able to sit back and see, read, something that someone like, I don't know, Casey on writes, or some, or something, and just read something, or hear something, and be like, wow, these motherfuckers are articulate as fuck. And so it's, at least there's that, you can sit back and go, wow, thank you, Scott. There's so many people speaking up and speaking out and doing it wonderfully that at least, I feel comfortable.
For folks who might not remember or been engaged, Def Comedy Jam was an interesting, Def Poetry Jam was an interesting platform at that moment, because where else would you have heard Saul Williams in the mainstream? Where else would you have heard Sonia Sanchez in the mainstream? Where else would you see Most Def on a weekly basis, in that kind of context? What we've seen over the last 15 years, of course, is a proliferation of these platforms. So there's a way in which it's the gift and the curse.
Yeah.
There's so much more stuff now. There's so much more genius or access to genius, but sometimes that genius gets blacked out by all of this other stuff. Your book that you published last year, you have this way of thinking about Donald Trump, right, and contemporary American popular culture. And you said that we're all Donald Trump's fucking apprentice. That's kind of the world that we're in now. Talk a little bit about how we process culture now, and even how we deal with the significance of someone like Donald Trump, in the way that he's significant at this moment.
Well, one, I think it's important to look at the global factor in relation to Trump, like the rise of the neo-fascists in many cultures and societies right now is prevalent. You see it in France, you see it in England, you see it in Turkey, you see it in Burundi, you see it. And so the fact that it's happening here as well is not fully surprising. And to me, it's not fully surprising because, I sat back 15 years ago listening to rappers talk about I'm the Black Trump, and then being like, that's bullshit. I felt like, to be quite honest, I remember being at a party at Dream Hampton's house in 94 or 95 in Brooklyn. And I remember that she played the Get Money, and I remember the entire party, everybody going crazy because it was Brooklyn and it was Brooklyn's own. And I remember thinking then, we're fucked. The flow might be nice, but the idea behind Get Money at all costs, the idea of, and you see it up till now, like when you look at Formation and it's like best revenge is your paper. And I'm like, oh wow, it's crazy how flawed the message is. I'm not certain that's the best revenge is what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, capitalism is not the answer. That there are greater answers to be found. And when we have, like right now, we're lucky because in this day, over the past 5 years, we can say suddenly we have, once again, a new generation of famous philosophers, thinkers, professors, you know, and what have you, public intellectuals, and all this stuff. And that's a proliferation that's recent, you know. But when I was back crying about what was happening in hip hop, it was primarily because those were the only like famous public intellectuals we had. You know, so when Jay-Z was like, you know, I couldn't help the poor, if I was one of them, I'd be like, dude, don't say that in the microphone. You need to read this. You need to say, you know, and then seeing people like get excited about it, it frightened me. And so when you see Trump rise up, no, it's not really a surprise because we have somewhat of a lost generation that has experienced, for example, entertainment as pure and utter escape. And you see a lot of artists right now, trying to go back and say, no, entertainment can mean this, you know, and we can talk about these issues in entertainment, you know, but at that time, people like me and Yassine, Erica, many of us felt alone in that quest, you know, and they would want to label it conscious or backpack or whatever. Like, no, this is just fresh, actually. But yeah, it comes as no surprise seeing something like Trump happen, unfortunately. And then with the backlash with Obama, you know, once Obama hit office and seeing that blockade that was formed and the Tea Party rise up and all this that has gone down. No, it's not really a surprise. There's a lot of reckoning and self-reckoning that needs to come into play, and we have to look at ourselves. We have to be unafraid to look at ourselves and what brought this into play. But also what brought this into play, I believe, is just the lack of public resources going towards education. And once that happens, getting over with shit like that is easy.
Yeah. Talk about your process and how you come into the world as an artist. You name a whole bunch of folks here, you know, in the piece, you know, coded language. But you obviously weren't just listening to words, right? You're actually listening to music and you hear it in the cadence and everything. So who are the folks that you were listening to that made you think about art and becoming an artist? And what was your process? I mean, was it in the schooling? Was it in what you were getting at home? Did you have to seek and find stuff? And the seek and find stuff is kind of interesting for cats like us because there was no Google, right? There was no YouTube for us to find stuff. I mean, we're going through Encyclopedia Britannicas and the World Book and all that kind of stuff just to find information, where we now have a generation that has information literally at their fingertips.
Well, yeah. I mean, we come from the generation we were buying like copies of Stolen Legacy on the streets. Right.
Because shit was out there, right? Because Negroes didn't eat, so shit was out there.
You know, well, one, you know, that's fine. That flash of people who are like giving honor to God. One, I think of my parents. I was thinking giving honor to my parents who turned me on to some great shit.
Yeah.
At, you know, from the cusp. You know, like I came home at 8 years old telling my parents I want to be an actor when I grow up, and my father's response was, you should get a law degree. I support you as an actor if you get a law degree. My mother's response was, so you should do your next school report on Paul Robeson. And so, I mean, I'm 8 or 9 years old right there. And it was mind-fucking from that moment. And so, really, that just laid the template. That little moment right there. Who's Paul Robeson? So it starts like that. Then there's the years, you know, at the lunch table as a rapper, whatever, but also like defending hip hop, not only to like other peers who like, it's not even music, you know, they're just talking to the, you know, meanwhile I didn't realize that those same kids were wearing like Fishbone and Bad Brain t-shirts, and I didn't know who Fishbone and Bad Brain was, so I didn't realize that they were actually kind of cool, those kids, they could be, that they could have turned me on to something if I was paying attention, but I was like that. Between that and then, of course, also defending it to my parents with artists, with the help of artists like, you know, KRS and Public Enemy, and then going like, okay, well, that's versus like being in the car when like Lottie Dottie comes on and my mom being like, with your wrinkle, and she's like, really? but those types of references mixed with then traveling. When I was 16, I was an exchange student. I lived in Brazil for a year, and from that moment on, hip hop hadn't arrived in Brazil yet, so I was forced to listen to other shit. And the internet wasn't there either, and so wasn't anywhere really. And so I was forced to explore, you know, other worlds of music, other worlds of literature. So that was helpful, and that started building a habit of wanting to explore other worlds of music and literature, and wanting to spend time outside of the country, because I learned that, you know, when I could step outside of the box and look at it, I had a whole different, you know, layer of insights that were hitting me from the outside. So then I started craving that ability to step outside more and more, so that I could look at it, so that I wasn't only in the midst of it, but could pull back from it and go, okay, and this is how this connects to what's happening here and here and here, and connect those dots. That's been helpful. And then theater. Primarily because you know, one of the things I loved about being an actor in the theater was the amount of time that we spent before we got on our feet. I love being on my feet and, you know, performing, but also breaking down the literature around the table and breaking down, you know, great literature into beats and objectives and all this stuff. It taught me a lot about writing, about reading, and it kind of trained my eye towards what I was looking for when I picked up a book, or what have you. And then, yes, and then literature at large. From, you know, really diving in. You know, I dove in at a regular pace, you know, like, well, as a kid, maybe it was a little strange to be reading so much Shakespeare in my spare time, when I discovered that I liked that. But aside from that, you know, I got into whatever, Nancy Drew or whatever, and at some point, you know, reading, like, you know, the proper autobiographies and from Masada to Malcolm, all that stuff, and then getting into Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston, and probably at the age of 17, I think I was, when I read Temple of My Familiar, there was also something that really clicked for me as I, you know, read this story of a woman divorcing her husband, not because she didn't want to be with him, but because she didn't like what it felt like to be suppressed by the institution of marriage itself. And that got me thinking about women and feminism, and my mother and my two sisters, and all this type of stuff. And then I went to Morehouse, which was across the street from Spelman. And Morehouse, I was a drama and philosophy major, but Morehouse didn't have a drama department. So all of my drama classes were at Spelman. And so then I was forced into this new layer of like Professor Linda Dickerson forcing all of the men in the department to come on the full moon to participate in menses rituals, where, you know, the women would wear white and the men would just have to come, shut up, and hold white candles while she led the women in all sorts of like prayers and rituals, and we'd just be there holding white candles. And this is at the same time that Dr. Dre's The Chronic comes out, and women are in Jeeps on Spelman's campuses blasting bitches ain't shit but hoes and tricks. And one of my playwriting professors, Joe Clegg, is coming into class like, what the fuck are y'all listening to? How can you nod your head to this shit? Because she had just come out with a book called Madame Miles, about how she could not take Miles' muted trumpet without hearing the muted screams of the women that he was vocal about being abusive towards. And so then I'm trying to listen to The Chronic, but everything I'm hearing in class is getting in my way, and also the girls that I'm trying to get at are getting in my way because they're in the same classes as me and being schooled by all this shit and coming home with like Bell Hooks books hanging out in the backpack. And so I'm from New York and at the party, and they're playing The Bitches Ain't Shit, which I love because they sample the bridge, and that's like the best use of that sample ever. But suddenly I'm not dancing as a form of protest because I'm just away from home and able able to now to be like really fluid with my nigga bitch language and all the shit that parenting around, but I can't dive into the bitch side now because I happen to go to school on Spelman's campus and I'm happy to be learning some shit that I'm not so happy to learn because it's burdening my process to enjoy myself. And so from there, you know, I'm really like wondering why, you know, and then I'm tripping up on like meeting Alice Walker and then Angela Davis and Maya Angelou and all, you know, and all this stuff and then all the reading Audre Lorde and getting all
Beverly
this
got
deep
chefed
shit.
out?
Yeah, huh?
Beverly got chefed out?
Of course, you know, and I'm looking back at all the footage from like the 60s and 70s and saying, not until the black man, not until the black man, and it never sounds right. I'm like, wow, these women saying the black man. And I find myself getting deeper and deeper situated into this question of power, Bessie Head, you know, into this question of power and looking at, you know, these cats walking through and with around their privilege and hypocrisy on Morehouse's campus while realizing that there's some fucking scholars across the street, and so spending more time there. And yeah, it just fucked my head up. and that was that.
That shit is brutal. You're gonna have to crop that piece separately from the totality piece and just post that piece, right? Saul Williams on how he became Saul Williams. You mentioned the stage piece, right? And of course, slam is where many folks first get introduced to you. You're also brilliant, if not enough of you was on screen in something like Lackawanna Blues. But in the summer of 2014, you were part of a collective of folks who are on Broadway on a musical dealing with the life of Tupac Shakur, right? How long was that piece on Broadway?
6 weeks.
Fast forward a year, Hamilton shows up. And it's the best thing since sliced bread, right? Cards on the table, I ain't seen Hamilton, right? So I can't comment on Hamilton in that way. What do you think is the difference, right? Because both of them are being packaged as hip hop on Broadway.
Right.
One survived 6 weeks, right? The other one's performed at the White House.
Right.
What's the difference? What happened? Why didn't Tupac hit and why does
I think what's
Hamilton?
exciting about Hamilton is that you have, you know, this revolution in diversity casting, but talking about a story that is very much American and very much situated in the patriarchy. So the casting defeats it, but the story itself doesn't necessarily threaten the patriarchal, you know, existence of the imperialist whatever. Whereas the story, although the play did not circle around the story of Tupac, it used the text of Tupac, and I don't know if you hear me. There we were talking about incarcerated black men in prisons in America, and
Violence in Chicago.
yeah, violence in Chicago and in the Midwest or what have you. And this is like, the play ended 2 weeks before Mike Brown was murdered. And the entire thing that we heard while we were on Broadway was like, it's not really relevant. It challenges audiences too much. You know, they're coming for entertainment. They're choosing between Rocky the musical and this. And so I would say that although, so it's a question of threatening and non-threatening. You know, I think that Hamilton is a wonderful piece that like I said, the brilliance there is in the use of rhyming to tell the story and in who's playing these roles. But it's not necessarily a story about how to destroy the system, you know. However, if you hear me, it's very much about, yo, fuck this system. What the fuck is going on here? You know, it started, I mean, I wish you could just see the opening of the play, which was me in a prison suit coming down from the ceiling of the theater in a cage with no music, saying they got a nigga shedding tears, you know? and then the orchestra comes up under me as this prison, this guy in this prison cell is coming down over the audience in this orange jumpsuit.
And this is 2 years before we see Kendrick in the Grammy Awards.
Yeah, that's what that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what that was. Right. So it was intense. And don't get me wrong, Broadway has been used to that type of intensity before. In fact, I grew up going to Broadway plays. That's another point of inspiration for me, is that I grew up in New York. My father went to the School of Music and Art and trained as an opera singer. My mother was very much involved with the theater, and because my father pastored a church, whenever there were plays with the potential of a black audience on Broadway, they were sending free tickets to the churches so that, that the pastor might say, we're gonna do a bus trip. And, so your arms too short, the bus. I saw the wigs on my mind. Like all of that shit. I saw Sarafina 7 times on Broadway. And that changed my life. Because the connection that I was able to make between what was happening in South Africa and these actors who had all been exiled from their country for participating in this play. Who I then would always see like in Washington Square Park or hanging around the city in clubs and what have you. Oh, that's Colgate from Serafina out at a party, look at that. And all that, because they couldn't go home, right, at that time. And man, the power, I don't know if I've ever seen a more powerful play than what I saw when I saw that on Broadway. And so I know Broadway can handle, I saw lots of powerful shit on Broadway in the past, all the August Wilson stuff and what have you. But in that moment, which is, just a little bit, like you said, just 2 years ago, we were still in the heights of this cultural aesthetic that had so much to do with, like I said, entertainment as escape, these franchise superheroes that, like Captain America. Like, and don't get me wrong, because the shit that's coming out now was made 2 years ago, right? So I'm looking at Tarzan, like, these motherfuckers remade Tarzan. I'm like, can I get Sam Jackson's number? I'm like, I'm sorry, bro, but I'm just like, these motherfuckers remade Tarzan.
and he a Morehouse brother, so
there's so much shit like that where I'm like, really? Is that what's going on? But it's not just that, like we have celebrated lots of bullshit, and so we reap the ramifications of that, which has everything to do with sometimes plays getting canceled or albums not selling or what have you. But this is a beautiful moment now. Right now, this is dope. But it's still ignoring a lot of shit. But yeah.
Let's talk about this beautiful moment for a moment. We were talking briefly before, we got this thing started, and thinking about who Ava DuVernay is in the world right now, right? So a lot of people know Selma, but then you're looking at what she's doing on the movie screen with the 13th, this documentary about the 13th Amendment, right? At the same time that she's taking over television with Queen Sugar, right, about a very specific kind of black regional experience in the South. Everything that we had hoped OWN TV would have been 3 years ago is finally coming to fruition, right? Because of Queen Sugar, because of Greenleaf, and all these kind of serious black dramas on television. We talked about what's happening on Broadway, right? Both looking at like the work of Noble and Sissel and Noble Sissel and Beauty Blake, 90 years ago, right? Suddenly on on Broadway, even in the context of what's happening in terms of say, Captain America. Captain America is going to give us Black Panther, right? Both in terms of the large screen, but also in terms of the comic book, reboot and all those kinds of things. What do you think that signals at this moment, right? This kind of, because we're really actually going through a period of renaissance that I haven't seen in my lifetime. Right?
We are, and it's amazing to acknowledge that. Sometimes I think we get a bit too self-congratulatory and celebratory at times as well too, because I think it makes us forgetful. Like we act like power in the hands of someone black cannot be corrupted, like the way that African dictator before. You know what I'm saying?
Damn.
Like, it's not that simple.
Right.
You know, it's not that simple. Seeing someone that looks like me in that position of power doesn't necessarily fucking solve the problem.
Hell, my president.
Right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's cool. I think it's cool, but there's still, I'm never satisfied, you know, but,
I mean, because you talk about that global piece, right? Because, you know, our heads are all in what's happening here, but how do you make that connection to that global piece? You have this piece on your new album, Martyr, Loser, King, right? And catch the little rhythm there, right? Martyr, Loser, King, right? How do we reframe and think about a figure like Martin Luther King in that kind of context?
Right.
But you got this piece called Burundi, right? In which you're deliberately talking about more of a global stage. And
Yeah.
You're talking about the hacker
Yeah.
on your hard drive. Talk a little bit about how important this global piece is now, particularly from an American perspective.
Okay, from an American perspective, let's just say, from an American perspective, 11,000 sub-Saharan migrants have been picked up in the Mediterranean over the last 3 days. On the cusp of drowning, and hundreds have drowned, thousands have drowned over the last 3 days, over the last 6 months. Forget about it.
And we're talking about
You know?
Mike Pence. And we're talking about Mike Pence in mainstream.
Yeah. But we're also talking about what's happening here with police brutality and all this shit. But the fact of the matter is that that globally, Black Lives Matter, for an example, has the potential to reach out and acknowledge that, because like I said, most of the people in those, I've been to those migrant camps in France and in England and in where was I just now? Norway, Sweden. I don't know, yeah. And many of the migrants are from Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, Burundi, Congo, on and on and on and on and on, meaning that the migrants are not only Syrian and Afghani, they're also that, and they're from Uzbekistan as well. And of course, Europe is reckoning with that. And we're kind of just not talking about it. We don't get it, it's too far away. But the numbers are astounding. And that is my question to you and all of us, is how do we connect the dots between what is of importance to us here, and also realizing the power that we have. You know, we shouldn't get so wrapped in the front lines of our struggle here without realizing that as African Americans, as Americans, we're still coming from one of the most privileged platforms on this planet. So you can get wrapped in your shit here and be like, I'm not free, and take one step out of the country with your passport and you'll be like, oh. You'll experience white privilege real quick. And you realize that it's not white privilege, that it's American privilege that you're experiencing right now. You can have, and we're already experiencing it right now comparatively. When you look at what cats are really dealing with, I mean, we don't have time to go into some of the stories that I've heard in some of these refugee camps. It's absurd that, you know, it's just, you know, it makes that number of our 2 million people in prison look like, I mean, it's just crazy. So, I don't know how we connect those dots other than just forcing ourselves and our politicians to answer bigger and broader questions. I mean, it's a humanitarian crisis. I'm not speaking of that, I'm speaking of what's happening here is a humanitarian crisis, and it's really just a matter of realizing that when we say Black Lives Matter, it's a global epidemic. And so we should have the wherewithal to understand and study how it's a global epidemic and get beyond our American lack of sense of geography and learn where the fuck a certain place is and what's going on there and there and there. And then when you talk about that song Burundi, you know, where you're talking about, I mean, the song circles around, Martin Luther King is the screen name of a hacker in this graphic novel that I've been working on that'll come out next year. All right, and it's really the name of a hacking collective, and they live in a tech hub that's been built on beside an e-waste camp. And an e-waste camp is that you know that we get new computers and phones not when ours are dead all the time, but when new ones come out. And so, in fact, there's places where scavenger culture is still prevalent, meaning places where they can put piles of shit and people will go through and mine out the wires and the copper and the stuff that's reusable. And so many of those places are in the same place where they mine the coltan or tantalum or cobalt, which is a precious stone that we all have in our pockets right now because it distributes power. I love this, that this thing mined from the Congo and Burundi and Rwanda distributes power in small circuitry boards. So every time you're browsing on something and every time your phone is alive and awake, it's because of the coltan and cobalt. You got a little taste of Africa in your phone. Right? And you can imagine that the story around those mines is not very different from the story around those diamond mines. It's not very different from the story around those cotton plantations, you know, or those sugar plantations, or those rubber fields, or those, you know, it's the same fucking shit. So that you have all of this modern day digital technology, you know, that is based on analog exploitation. Extremely analog exploitation. Child labor and the likes of it. Right now, today, being mined, right now, in the iPhone 7. What? You know? And it's not shit we can do. We feel powerless. We're just like, well, fuck. You know, the least I can do is record some good shit and record this, you know, you know, because that's until we can find a way to hold our governments and corporations accountable. I don't know what to do. So what do? Me, I'm like, well, let's put it in songs. Let's put it in movies, and let's, you know, because me, I don't have the patience for the do-gooder shit, really. Like you might hear, you know, like you might hear of the shit that I'm talking about, but I'm actually more interested in the beat. You know, like that's what draws me into a song or a sound. I don't listen to something just because it has a good message.
Right.
It better have some good music behind it. You know? And so then you get into the idea of tricking people into doing the right thing, you know, or to paying attention to the right things and what have you. And yeah, the story behind Burundi is crazy on many levels, just because, you know, I'm from a place called Newburgh, New York, which is an hour upstate, from New York City. And Newburgh for the past 45 years has had the highest murder rate, drug trafficking rate, crime rate, sexual crime rate in New York State. You know, the night that Tawana Brawley went through her shit, that was in Newburgh, and then right next to Newburgh in Rockers Falls. That's our claim to fame. That and a documentary that Russell Simmons produced called Crackhead University. And the irony is, I know everybody in that documentary. Well, I chose to center a story in Burundi because it's situated next to Rwanda in the same way that Newburgh is situated next to New York City. So that is the thing that we're not talking about that has this crazy thing going on. But we know about the atrocity in Rwanda, although we may not understand it and its ramifications connected to what we're going through right now, like in the face of Trump and all of that stuff. You know, it's crazy what you can learn through atrocity and how it can project your understanding like light years forward through atrocity. You get that, and then suddenly it's like, oh no, Hutu Tutsi, I don't play that anymore. We don't play with that binary opposition of ethnicity anymore. I saw where that landed us. So why are you guys talking about this black-white shit? You know, like you start to see what can happen if you pay attention to that shit, you know? So, and Burundi right now, I mean, like over the past 8 months, has had over 300,000 refugees leave that country because their president has broken the Constitution and forced himself into a third term. which some of us here would hope Obama would do. You know, so it's
It still would be a lesser of all evils, but anyway.
yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, that's all we're talking about. If we're talking about, you know, policy and politics at this point, of course. Yeah.
We're gonna open it up to the audience for some questions now.
Yeah, I've had like very long-winded responses.
We're good there, we're good.
I have a question. My voice is loud enough, I'm sure, but given the state of hip hop right now in this country, do you think it's more a matter of who they allow us to hear, or is it a matter of the people making the music not having a global enough perspective to be able to, you know, the problems, the worldwide global scene, you know, they're dealing with problems here sometimes, but for the most part, what we hear is money, party at all costs, and that's it. And again, is that because that's the only thing they're allowing to come out, or is it because we just don't have the capability because we're not rounded enough globally? My favorite authors and my favorite artists tend to have a global perspective, have lived outside of the country for a while or experienced other cultures, and that gives you a chance to get perspective on what's going on here.
Right.
But that, could you speak a little bit about hip hop now and the socialization as it, you know?
Forgive me if my first inclination is to ask, what are you listening to?
Yeah.
No, only because you're sitting here with like a suit and a tie, and you look like you might be a couple of years older than you're like 2 or 3 years old. So I'm just curious.
Well, I listen to some of everything. You know, I find the value, again, in the music, in the content, and I'm one of those people that can easily listen to classical music, as rock music, as hip hop. I mean, I'm a very eclectic taste.
You know, one of my favorite Sufi poets, Hafiz, has a poem where he says, "The other is a lie." I don't really believe that they are controlling what we're choosing to listen to. I believe that we can do enough damage to ourselves. You know, I also think that it's not so much, you know, like I don't hold into hip hop artists necessarily have to talk about all the shit that's going on and not get wrapped up in the excitement of a new car or a girl or what have you. Because sometimes it's not what's being said, sometimes it's how it's being said. And I would say that most of what's going on, you know, I would say post like since like drill rap and like Chief Keef and then like the whole Chicago footwork movement and juke and all that, I would say that what's been happening in hip hop has been, and this is really coming from like the Southern influence, has been more about style than content. So that people like myself would be like, but they're not saying anything, and ignoring the fact that they're saying it in a way that's completely original. You know, so that you hear a guy rapping like, nigga, you're like, is that choppy ass? But when you start to feel it with the music, you're like, holy shit, this would be even more amazing if
he was saying something. It's the young thug.
Yeah. But I'm still, you know, wrapped up in the presentation of like, how that is the most amazing flow ever. And anyone who records, like myself, half the stuff that I record in gibberish first. And so it's really, to me, like they just kept the demos and kept the gibberish. Like this, and you're doing that because you're just trying to find the nuance of where the voice should be placed and what the proper flow is. Even syllabically, like, okay, this many syllables, and then when you're writing, you're trying to match the syllables in the gibberish just to make so that you don't betray what you found when you were just playing around with where it should go. You know? So I'm not really mad at, you know, 18-year-old kids making songs about whatever that are really just there for you to dance and dab to. Like, I feel it. I remember the sensation and I'm into it. Sometimes I'm more annoyed by the handling of like misinformation. You know? But I will concur that yes, we could be more globally informed. But even in terms of our taste in music, because for example, ever since the whole like, what do you call it, auto-tune thing started happening, and the thing that's going on Post Malone or something like that, or Travis Scott, that stuff sounds a lot like the Algerian rye music and the Egyptian rye music that was happening in the 80s. And when the French hip hop kids who are already knowledgeable about that, heard what these new American kids were doing, their versions of it are way fresher. They're taking it to a whole new level, like, oh, you're into this? Oh, I can deliver that. So actually, and there, you listen to that stuff and it's another language, you won't understand shit. You know, I often tell my wife, who is Rwandan, and you know, English is like her third or fourth language, you know, that she's lucky to be able to hear some of the stuff that she likes, like the Young Thug, where she's just like listening to like Riri, and like, and she's just like, this is amazing, you know, and because she doesn't understand the words, she's just like, holy shit, you know, like you're so lucky to not understand it. I wish I didn't understand at the time, but it's true. You know, there's a lot of freedom and levity in being able to hear music and not understand it. You know, and music is its own alchemy, so to speak. And so we can't be as controlling with it as we are with a term paper or an essay, because there's some shamanism and something at play in the music itself that's doing its thing, even when sometimes the lyrics are crazy, unless they're just violent and absurd. So it's a hard call. But do we need to, could musicians as well benefit from being aware of what's going on globally, even if it's just in music? Hell yeah. Because it's been a minute since the freshest hip hop has been coming from the States. It's not necessarily the case right now.
I think the thing that's important also when you offer the critique in coded language, right? It's a different media platform, right? So to talk about what we hear and what we didn't hear was a very real conversation in 2001. In 2016, there are so many different platforms to access. There is so much stuff out there. I'm looking at you, and Pierce Freelon is sitting directly behind you, has a band called The Beast that's been doing the work for years, right? And you can find that, but you're never going to hear Pierce on the radio, right? Just like you're never going to hear Rhapsody on the radio, you're never going to hear Chance the Rapper on the radio, though you'll see him in a Kit Kat commercial, which is a whole nother conversation, right? But there's so much stuff that's out there, and I think the difficulty is trying to get folks connected to those platforms and comfortable with those platforms. You know, you talk about the digital and the analog. We need to break away from analog media in the sense that stop listening to your radio.
But we also need to break away from the sense of we limit ourselves tremendously by like I was trying to say there, by simply focusing on Anglophone.
Right.
Shit that's just in English, you know? And that goes for literature, that goes for articles, that goes, if you haven't read a book this year that was translated from another language and you think the most progressive thought is the shit that you were exposed to, you're probably wrong, you know? Because let me tell you, for example, right now I'm reading Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, and which I'm excited to read because I didn't know there was an American thinking like that, because I've been reading Beatriz Preciado, Testo Junkie. And I was like, and she's Spanish, I've been like, holy fuck, this is the fucking Bible. Testo Junkie by Beatriz Preciado. Yes, that is something I'm telling you to check out. Or reading Virginie Despentes in France, and I'm like, holy fuck, Virginie Despentes, who's in America writing novels like this, you know? And so there's that sense also, and the same thing goes for music and what have you. What's crazy about when you go to other cultures and countries is they're familiar with all of your shit and their shit. And you travel and you're only familiar with your shit. Now you can break that a little bit. You go to those places and I bet you that they haven't necessarily heard of Octavia Butler, you know? And so that, you know, when they come at you with their like, oh yes, I read everything Bald and Richard like that, but have you read Octavia Butler? You can then get them into like, oh, no, I didn't write that. You know, like there's, you know, ways, you know? But, you know, like that, to me, I find that crucial, and that goes for, you know, like poets like Maud Darwish and like, you know, like if you haven't read, you know, what, you know, the great Syrian thinkers are saying about what's happening in Syria.
Right.
If you haven't read some of the great Islamic voices about, you know, what's going on now that are translated from Arabic or from whatever, if you've only been reading the New York Times and thinking that your shit is now, I would say that perhaps, you know, you need to find a way to encounter that other shit so that we can really come closer to looking at things from, you know, this perspective. Because what's happening here is amazing. But what's happening in Greece right now is crazy. What's happening in Turkey right now, what's happening in Spain, what's happening in Haiti right now, which is frightening to talk about all the time. It's frightening to talk about Haiti, especially now since you got people trying to convince people that they should vote for somebody that they don't really want to vote for, to get rid of the person that they definitely don't want to vote for. But in order to do that, you shouldn't necessarily bring up Haiti. Because you don't want to know about the Clintons in Haiti.
Real talk.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Lamont.
Brother Saul, thanks for coming out. I had a question in reference to something you said earlier about privilege. And I too, you know, was a product of parents who exposed me to the arts in this thing called the Black diaspora at a very early age. But you know, in my field of activism now, I'm finding that a lot of poor Black kids don't have that exposure, right? And liberation does begin with exposure, right, internally. And so, you know, on this notion of privilege, you know, how do we expose particularly poor Black and brown kids, you know, to this mental stimulation that they are very obviously disconnected from?
Yeah. You know, from the time I was a kid, I always thought reparations should come in the form of these amazing, like, schools and community centers and multimedia centers in our neighborhoods. I just felt like we're gonna be talking all day if our families are trying to get checks for money. Like, build these shits in our communities so that we can have these encounters. And, you know, because I see my friends and your friends and the charter schools and the people who start the after school programs, get money from Soros, whatever, to bring computers and after school programs and all that type of shit. I see that happening on, you know, on a scale. You know, I see it on a much larger scale in a lot of foreign countries where those same concerns are, and there's less of an infrastructure to get through to be able to bring those things to communities, right? Because I still believe very heavily in education, and know that when I felt trapped inside of my community and what have you, I found a lot of freedom in a book. Mm-hmm. It might have taken me a second to want to open that book, but eventually, once I did, that's how I started traveling. And most of those books were cheap or free, you know? And so when I think of issues like facing like underprivileged kids and what have you, I mean, like the biggest thing to me has been like, how do you, exactly that same question, how do you spark that mind or that interest? You know, and of course it usually comes with them encountering someone like yourself, some great teacher or something who's like, stay up, I'm gonna show you guys this movie. I'm gonna show you this clip on YouTube. I'm gonna get you a copy of this book. I'm gonna, you know, take you to this play. Da, 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 da. I mean, it's the same thing that was going on when I was a kid. It's that same shit. Answers beyond that, I'm not certain. What have you found? is helpful. I'm asking you for real.
You know, I've made it a personal quest of mine here in Durham, along with Pierce Freeline and several other community activists and artists here. I've made it a personal quest of mine to take what Dr. Mark Anthony Neal does in the classroom at Duke, to bring that down to the classroom on the community level. And we've been doing that in Durham here for several years. Tasana Handu, Rhapsody, Ninth Wonder, many other folk who are doing this great, awesome work. But we still find that, honestly, while we are organizing things downtown, there's a community called Documentaries, right across the street from an HBCU, North Carolina Central University. And there is a disconnect between the HBCU across the street, literally, and the hood, right? You know, so
there's always that disconnect next to that campus and that community. I see that in New Haven, I see that in Atlanta, I see that, you know, like that's yeah.
So we have to, those who have this knowledge and information and who are being exposed, you know, to this aesthetic, we have to be fearless in bringing this stimulation to the bottoms, right? You know, to the hood, and not be fearful that those folk are going to rob us because we're coming to turn them on to, you know, to some Saul Williams. So thank you for this moment. I will not be selfish. This is not my show. This is yours, my brother. Thank you so much for being here.
I hear you, thank you. But you know, it raises other questions, right? Because you know that if you do see those, like, I forget what you call those people who, that Clinton program, Teach America or whatever.
Teach for America.
Teach for America. If you saw a group of those kids in that hood, you'd be like, exactly, that look like. Really, y'all? I seen them in the Bronx a few weeks ago. A bunch of kids looking like those kids arriving, you know, in the projects in the Bronx, and they're looking like Mormon evangelists or something. You know what I'm saying? And I say Mormon evangelists because when I used to live in Brazil, that's why I used to encounter at my age, traveling through Brazil in suits as Mormon evangelists, you know. And it scared the shit out of me. And part of what you're saying is when you make a statement like that, it also encourages and inspires that, you know. And so you get that do-gooder, liberal thing stepping into the community, where in some cases, you know, you realize that the poverty that you're trying to address is even richer internally in the hearts and minds of those who are trying to help people who need perhaps less help than the people trying to deliver the help need. And maybe they can bring something to their community to make them self-reckon and look at themselves, and then we could, you know, like it's a complex thing that we're dealing with here in America, because also, you know, like we're sitting here talking all this shit, and like all this time has passed, and I still haven't mentioned like the indigenous communities in America. And that's the problem with this bullshit that we're facing, because that's the most pressing and real shit. But you know, like in America, I think of women, and that's globally. Like when I think of the big issues we face, and I think of the patriarchy, I think of, you know, my goal with my work, from Slam to my first book, She, to the second book, Send the Shotgun to the Head, to what I'm trying to say, even in coded language with like motherfuckers, and I mean literally those who desecrate the feminine when I say motherfuckers, and list men as listening receptacles needs to be increased. Men as listening receptacles need to be increased. I've been talking about how do we smash the patriarchy. I'm saying that if you want to address racism, if you want to address any of this shit, that's what we need to deal with first, because that's the biggest issue and the biggest oppressor and oppressor of humanity. And even when I look at the power of religion and all these fucking institutions, I see them wanting to control sex and women and get some free labor out of it. But I'm telling you that, and that's where we can deal with ourselves too. I mean, I'm on the phone yesterday dealing with my cousin who's my age, who's trying to grapple with this relationship to Nate Parker and poor Nate Parker, you know? And he's throwing in some Bill Cosby shit too. That's my family. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, do I have time to fucking text back this motherfucker? But if I don't respond, that's one more gone. You know what I'm saying? And that's what we're fucking facing. And between that and like when we talk about our rights here, and we don't talk about the inclusiveness that's needed for the indigenous land that we're on. And if we ignore that the same way the people we're pointing our fingers at ignored that, then what the fuck are we talking about? So, yes, it's a fucking shame what's going on in our communities, and perhaps one of the ways that we could address the issues what's going on in our community is arrange little class trips from the hood to the reservations. And let's connect that shit. I don't see anything more crucial than that. That, and then take them to those Menzies rituals that I got to hold candles for.
Real quick before the next question, if you don't know, that is Lamont Lilly, who's the vice presidential candidate for the World Workers Party.
Workers World?
Workers World Party, top of the ticket, Monica Moorhead. So, you know, if you want to vote for a black candidate this year, you have two in the ticket.
And I just came back from Standing Rock, so thank you so much for mentioning that.
Yep. So this is a question about her work. I was first captured in your poetry by the visual presentation of the words on the page, which is, if you haven't read his poetry, do. And I was just kind of luxuriating in the presentation of the words and the arrangement and the structure and all that sort of thing. But I have to tell you a funny story, is that as I'm leafing through, just kind of enjoying that part of it, I see these capital letters, and it, you know, because I'm leafing and I'm captured by the three capital letters, NGH, and I'm thinking, it's an acronym, like NGO. And then I looked at the words more carefully, around it, above, below, on either side. I went, no, not so much. So my question though is, any observations that you have, given the global nature of things, on the announcement yesterday of a new settlement in the West Bank?
These motherfuckers don't want to back down. You know, like it's I mean, it's bullshit that we recognize. So I don't want to go on some spiel about Palestine because I think you can guess my position. You know, I've been, and it was so fucked that it was like a cliche. Like when I arrived in Berlin, for example, I literally saw kids playing soccer with spent grenades. And I was like, come on, is this a fucking commercial for my activism? You know, did you guys do this for me? You're just playing soccer with a grenade. You know, like really, really, you know. But I would like to talk to the NGH because I am here performing, and Eric is so funny because he keeps saying he's here to perform a great piece with the Migos Quartet, and I'm thinking, does he not want to say the name of the piece? Because the name of the piece is Nigga What?
You probably don't want to say the name of the piece.
Right, but it's spelled NGHWHT, so maybe you just like, okay, it's an acronym. And that is from the book The Dead MC Scrolls. And what I was playing with there was the idea that we learned from ancient Kemet and also from ancient Hebrew societies, what have you, where the belief was that vowel sounds, when we first talked about writing and written language, and this brings us back to the idea that I'm trying to get at just in our relationship to the feminine and all this shit. There's a great book called, what? The Alphabet versus the Goddess, about the history of the written word and the role that that played in like dismantling and suppressing matriarchal and matrilineal voices and what have you in society. Beyond that, ancient Kemet believed that the vowel sound spoke to the eternal reality, right? So, and not only that, but the vowel sounds themselves spoke directly to what they sounded like. So, like the god of speech, Ptah, was wonder, O was surprise, U, E. And so, but when they would write down the words and names, they would only write the consonants because it was seen as like, kind of like, sacrilegious to try to capture the eternal reality of a vowel. And so you just write the consonants, and so that's why you would see the spelling of Yahweh, for example, with only the consonants there. And it's easy to understand if you think of yourself right now as being within, the containment of the letter O. And the walls are the consonants, and the space in between is what we walk and live through, right? And you have to leave that space for us to walk and enter and not be clobbered by bricks. So, Nickawat and the idea of capturing like some ancient relationship to language for me had everything to do with what I was hearing in hip hop and questioning what it meant for us to be, reciting shit out loud, screaming it, nodding our heads. It also helped me look at like shit, I would play around and like even look at the success of someone like Oprah. And I'd be like, it's because her name is Oprah. Her mom stumbled on that eternal vowel, Oprah, Yeah. Then you go Shonda Rhimes and you go, oh, okay, maybe not. But yeah, so in the work itself, I would say that in terms of writing, and that became really crucial for me at the very beginning, I was looking at the page itself as a stage. And because of the time that I've spent, dissecting plays and literature and what have you, the written word was always held strength and potential on the stage, and I never felt like it had to be bent one way or another in order for it to live on the stage. And so the test for me, especially as someone who's been called a spoken word artist or a slam poet or what have you, was always how well I can edit and clean this stuff on the page, and I knew that if it worked and stood strongly on the page, then it would stand the test of time, which I sometimes felt was a bit different from some of the stuff I was encountering in readings, where I felt like people were trying stuff out in the context of slams or open mics that worked very well on the stage, but was not necessarily edited in a way that would live on the page. And I felt a direct connection between how deeply you could hit something and how long that hit could last based on that. It's like, it's like harvesting good wheat. Like you just gotta get all the,
Thank you. My question is, I read recently that the scroll from that performance, the coded language scroll, is actually in the Smithsonian African American Museum in DC. So congratulations. I wanted to ask what you think the role of like a place like a museum has in a process of truth and reconciliation.
great. The people who built that museum, the organization surrounding that museum is the same organization that was around building the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, and like Truth and Reconciliation Museum in Rwanda, the Apartheid Museum is the first time I ever realized what happened in the museum. It's in Johannesburg, and I went there with a bunch of I think I was there with like Sekou Sudiata, Sarah Jones, Bosia, Levin Anderson, and Sugair Hamad, and then some. There were a few other local poets and people with us, and at the entrance of the museum, they're like, oh, no, white people are over here. Black people are over. No, you went over there. And so from the entrance of the museum, they're like, and you're just jolly like, oh, we're going to the museum. And they're like, you enter there, you enter there. And you're like, okay. And the journey begins to the point where you guys meet in the middle of the museum, and you're both like, and I remember being in that museum, sitting down. This is the first time I visited that museum, was 2003. And I remember sitting, you know, like how they have the movies sometimes in museums, so I sit to watch the movie. Like, I usually don't want to watch the movies in the exhibition, right? I'm not going to sit and watch the movie. And in the Basquiat exhibition, I said, I want to watch every movie. You know? But in this one, I sat down, and Yoko Ono too, just watching the flies. Okay, but I remember sitting down to watch this movie, and the narration begins, and it said something like, when the whites came to our land and raped our mothers and killed our children, and I'm like, looking at the ticket, like, it says the National Museum, you know, like, you can talk like this in the National Museum. I'm like, this is motherfucking truth right here. And it didn't stop. And that was the first time I realized what could go down with the museum if it was done right. And so from that point forward, I've met some of the people behind these museums, and I'm like, you guys are punk rock as fuck. I love the hell you do. You know, because they're very much thinking about, you know, like, what do you want the people leaving the museum to feel like? And sometimes you're like, I want them to feel like shit. I want them to feel broke, like, oh, fuck. I mean, there's a room, not in that museum, there's another one in Soweto. They did that too. I walked into the room, and I referenced this in my latest album because it's always, this image has never left me, walking into the room of a museum that's small as hell with 500 nooses hanging from the ceiling. And then on the walls are the names of all the prisoners during the apartheid regime who supposedly committed suicide or died in prison, right? And it has their cause of death, it has the name, and like, slipped on soap in the shower, slipped on soap and fell out the window. You know, like how they were listed as having died, you know? And it's a small little room, and I stood in that room, I don't know if it was minutes or hours, but just like, fucking hell. And that museum needs to be, you know, in the Carolinas under some of these poplar trees. You know, so there's a lot that can be done, you know? I mean, depending on how gully you want to get, I've seen some amazing museums now where I'm like, holy shit, you know? So yeah, I'm all for it. I haven't been to the museum yet. My mother and sisters are there today. But yeah, I'm all for it. I mean, when they approached me, the first thing Timothy Yang,
Good people.
yeah, told me, yeah, exactly, was like, well, we just acquired George Clinton's mothership. Like, we have to bring it into the 4th floor before we put in the walls. And so I was like, you had me. So what do you mean? That was that.
I'd like to thank Saul Williams for spending some time with us this afternoon.